Chapter 7. The Wildfire. The air in Maya's apartment still carried the faint musk of last night's collision, sweat, sex, and a lingering scent of his leather jacket tossed carelessly on her couch. She hadn't slept much since then, her body wired, her mind replaying every moment of his hands on her, his mouth claiming hers, the way he'd pushed her past every boundary she'd ever set for herself. She told herself she needed to get a grip, to put some distance between her and this man who was unraveling her life with every look, every word. But the truth was, she didn't want distance. She wanted him, again, now, always. And that realization scared the shit out of her. When her phone buzzed that evening with a text, "Outside, let me in," her heart lurched into her throat. No preamble, no charm, just a demand that made her thighs clench. She didn't bother replying, just crossed to the door, her bare feet silent on the hardwood, her pulse already racing, like she was stepping into a fight she knew she'd lose. She opened the door, and there he was, leaning against the frame, his jaw tight, his dark eyes burning with something raw and unrestrained. No slow build this time, no playful smirks or teasing banter. Just him, his leather jacket still speckled with the day's earlier rain, his hair slightly damp, his presence filling the doorway like a storm about to break. The tension in his frame told her he'd been holding something back, something that had finally snapped. "Say it," he demanded, his voice low and rough, like gravel underfoot, sending a shiver straight to her core. Her breath caught, her lips parting as she tried to keep her voice steady. "Say what?" He stepped closer, one hand bracing against the doorframe, his body looming over hers, close enough that she could smell the faint mix of rain, oil, and that dark, primal scent that was all him. "That you want me here," he said, his eyes locked on hers, unyielding, daring her to lie. She didn't hesitate this time. "I want you here," she said, the words spilling out like a confession, raw and reckless, her voice trembling with need. It was like tossing a match into a room soaked with gasoline. He closed the space between them in 3 long strides, his hands finding her hips and pulling her against him so hard she gasped, her body molding to his, every inch of him hard and unyielding against her softness. The kiss was rougher this time, teeth clashing, tongues tangling, a low, guttural sound rumbling in his throat that made her shiver all the way down her spine. Her fingers fisted in his shirt, yanking him closer, needing to feel him, to drown in him, and he let her, but only just enough, his control a thin, fraying thread that made every touch feel like a dare. "Been thinking about this," he murmured against her mouth, his voice ragged, his lips brushing hers as he spoke, each word a spark igniting something deeper. "About you, standing there in that fucking coffee shop, pretending you didn't want me to bend you over the counter right then and there." A desperate sound escaped her, not quite a word, more a whimper, and he grinned against her skin, wicked, knowing, the kind of grin that promised trouble. His hands slid under her thin cotton shirt, his calloused fingers rough against her bare skin, leaving trails of heat as he pushed the fabric up and over her head, tossing it somewhere behind him. Before she could catch her breath, he lifted her, his hands strong and sure, pinning her against the nearest wall with a thud that rattled the picture frames. Maya gasped, startled by the sudden motion, her legs instinctively wrapping around his waist, but he didn't let her fall. His hands were everywhere, gripping her thighs, sliding up her sides, claiming every inch of her like she was something he'd fought for and won. "You're fucking dangerous," she whispered, half breathless, her nails digging into his shoulders through his shirt, her body arching against him. Good, he growled, his mouth finding her neck, his teeth grazing the sensitive skin just below her ear, hard enough to make her moan. So are you. It was chaos after that, a wildfire that consumed everything in its path. His jacket hit the floor, followed by his shirt, her fingers raking over the hard planes of his chest, tracing the faint scars and the ink that curled across his shoulder. Her jeans were gone in a blur, his hands tearing at the denim like it offended him, and when he pressed himself against her, the hard length of him evident through his jeans. She moaned again, louder this time, her head falling back against the wall. "Fuck, you sound good," he muttered, his voice thick with want, as his hand slid between her thighs, finding her already wet, her panties soaked from the moment he'd walked in. His fingers teased her through the lace, slow and deliberate, making her hips buck against his hand, chasing the pressure she needed. "Look at you, so fucking ready for me." "Stop talking," she gasped, her hands fumbling with his belt, her fingers shaking with urgency. "Just fuck, just do it." He laughed, a dark, dirty sound that made her ache even more, but he didn't make her wait long. His jeans hit the floor, and then he was lifting her again, his hands gripping her ass as he pressed himself against her, the thin barrier of her panties the only thing between them. "You want this?" he asked, his voice low, almost a growl, his eyes searching hers for one last confirmation. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking, her nails digging into his back. "God, yes." That was all it took. He tore her panties aside, the fabric ripping under his grip, and then he was inside her, filling her in one slow, deliberate thrust that made her cry out, her body arching against the wall. It was rough, urgent, a collision of need and want that had been building for weeks, every teasing glance, every charged moment leading to this. He moved with a rhythm that was both controlled and relentless, his hands bruising her hips, his mouth claiming hers again, swallowing her moans as she clung to him, her body trembling with the intensity of it. He slowed, just when she thought she couldn't take it anymore, his hips rolling against hers in a way that made her see stars, drawing out every sensation until she was begging, her voice a broken mess of pleas and curses. "Fuck, please," she gasped, her nails raking down his back, leaving marks she knew he'd feel later. "That's it," he growled against her ear, his voice rough with exertion, his breath hot against her skin. "Let go, sweetheart. I've got you." When she came, it was like a dam breaking, her body shattering around him, her cries echoing in the small apartment, drowned out only by the rain outside. He followed her over the edge moments later, a low groan tearing from his throat as he pressed himself deeper, his grip on her tightening like he never wanted to let go. By the end of it, Maya was still pressed against the wall, her pulse racing, her hair a tangled mess, every nerve in her body buzzing like she'd been struck by lightning. Her legs were still wrapped around him, his forehead resting against hers, their breaths mingling in the humid air. She could feel the sweat on his skin, the faint tremor in his hands as he held her, and it made her want him all over again. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his eyes dark and intense, his thumb brushing her cheek in a gesture that was almost tender. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low and certain, a promise that sent another shiver through her. Not even fucking close. And as she stood there, still trembling, still caught in the aftershocks of what they'd done, she knew he was right. This wasn't just a wildfire, it was an inferno, and she was already burning. Chapter 8. Aftershock. Maya woke to a quiet that wasn't quite silent, a charged stillness, heavy with the lingering heat of the night before. Her bedroom was dim, the early morning light filtering through the blinds in soft gray slants, but her body hummed with a restless energy, every muscle loose and sore in a way that felt like a delicious bruise. Her skin still tingled where his hands had been, her lips swollen from his kisses, her thighs marked by the memory of his grip. The sheets were tangled around her, smelling faintly of him, leather, sweat, and that dark, primal scent that had her craving him even now, hours after they'd collapsed in a sweaty, breathless heap. He was sitting at the edge of the bed, shirtless, his elbows resting on his knees, his head bowed like he was deep in thought. The sharp lines of his back were etched in the half-light, muscles shifting under his skin with each slow breath, a faint scar curling across his shoulder blade like a signature of some past fight. He looked both calm and coiled, like a predator at rest but ready to spring, and the sight of him, raw, unguarded, here, made her stomach flip in a way that was equal parts desire and danger. "You always wake up like that?" she asked, her voice still scratchy from sleep, and the memory of his name on her lips screamed into the dark hours ago. He turned his head, and that slow, dangerous grin spread across his face, the one that made her feel like he could see every filthy thought in her head. His eyes raked over her, lingering on the way the sheet barely covered her chest, the curve of her hip exposed where the fabric had slipped. "Only when I've had nights like that," he said, his voice low and rough, like he'd smoked a pack of cigarettes or fucked her senseless. Both felt equally likely. Her pulse jumped, heat pooling low in her belly at the memory of his hands pinning her wrists, his mouth on her throat, the way he'd made her beg without saying a word. She shifted slightly, the sheet slipping further, and his grin widened, his eyes darkening like he knew exactly what she was thinking. He stood, crossing the room with that deliberate, unhurried pace that drove her fucking insane. His jeans slung low on his hips, the top button undone like a promise. He leaned one hand against the wall above her head, caging her in without touching her, his body close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off him. "You were quiet last night," he said, his voice a low growl, teasing but edged with something darker. At first, her cheeks flushed, a rush of heat crawling up her neck as she remembered the way she'd tried to hold back, to keep some shred of control, only to lose it completely when his fingers had found her, relentless and knowing. "You didn't seem to mind when I wasn't quiet later," she shot back, trying to sound defiant, but her voice came out breathy, betraying the ache already building between her thighs. His grin turned wicked, his eyes glinting with satisfaction. "No," he said, leaning closer, his breath warm against her cheek. "I fucking loved that part. The way you moaned my name when you came, could listen to that all day." Her breath hitched, her body reacting before her brain could catch up, a shiver running through her that she couldn't hide. He kissed her then, slower than last night, softer, but no less devastating. His lips moved against hers like he was savoring her, his tongue teasing just enough to make her melt into the mattress, her hands reaching for him without thinking. When he pulled back, she was breathless, her lips tingling, her body screaming for more. "You're dangerous in the morning," she murmured, her voice husky, her fingers trailing down his chest, feeling the hard planes of muscle, the faint roughness of hair under her touch. He laughed, a low, deep sound that vibrated through her, settling in her core like a spark. "Mornings when I'm the most honest," he said, his eyes locked on hers, unapologetic and hungry. "And right now, I'm thinking about how much I want to fuck you again, right here, until you can't walk straight." Her breath caught, a flush of heat spreading through her, and she hated how much she wanted exactly that. She slid out of bed, grabbing his discarded t-shirt from the floor and pulling it over her head. It smelled like him, clung to her thighs, and barely covered her ass, and she could feel his eyes on her the whole time, watching her like she was the most fascinating thing he'd ever seen. "You staring at me now?" she asked, glancing over her shoulder as she headed toward the kitchen, trying to keep her voice light, trying to pretend her legs weren't trembling with want. "Yeah," he said, completely unashamed, following her with that same predatory grace. "Because you're thinking about last night, about how bad you want me to bend you over that counter and make you scream again." She froze halfway to the kitchen, her hand gripping the edge of the doorway, his words hitting her like a punch. He was right. Fuck, he was always right. And the worst part was she didn't want to deny it. The memory of his hands on her, his cock inside her, the way he'd pushed her to the edge and held her there until she broke, it was all she could think about. Her panties, if she'd been wearing any, would have been soaked. "Cocky," she said, turning to face him, her voice low, trying to reclaim some ground. He stepped closer, crowding her against the counter, his hands bracing on either side of her, trapping her in the best possible way. "Confident," he corrected, his voice a low growl, his eyes dark with intent. "And you fucking love it." This time, she didn't wait for him to make the first move. She kissed him, her hands fisting in his hair, pulling him down to her, her body pressing him back against the counter. He let her take control, for a moment, his lips curving into a grin against her mouth as she bit his lower lip hard enough to make him groan. Her hands slid down his chest, nails scraping lightly, and she could feel the way his muscles tensed, the way his breath hitched when her fingers brushed the waistband of his jeans. "Careful," he murmured when she pulled back, both of them breathless, his voice rough with want. "You keep this up, I might not let you leave this apartment today. Might just fuck you on every surface until you're begging me to stop." Maya's lips curved into a slow, dangerous smile, matching his for the first time, a thrill running through her at the thought. She leaned in, her lips brushing his ear, her voice low and teasing. "Good," she said, her hands sliding lower, palming him through his jeans, feeling him harden under her touch. His groan was a low, primal sound, and before she could blink, he had her lifted onto the counter, his hands gripping her thighs, spreading them as he stepped between them. The t-shirt rode up, exposing her, and his eyes darkened, a hungry edge to his grin. "Fuck, Maya," he said, his voice thick, his fingers already teasing the edge of her bare skin. "You're gonna be the death of me." And as his mouth found hers again, his hands sliding higher, she knew this was no aftershock. This was the main event, and she was ready to burn. Chapter 9. The Edge. The city pulsed with life that night, a chaotic symphony of neon lights flickering in the drizzle, car horns blaring, and the low throb of bass spilling from bars and cracked windows. Maya's pulse matched the rhythm, her nerves alight with a restless energy that had been building since the morning. Since his hands on her thighs, his voice in her ear, the way he'd fucked her on her kitchen counter until she couldn't think straight. She'd spent the day trying to focus on work, case files, emails, the mundane rhythm of her life, but every moment was haunted by the memory of him, the way he'd looked at her like she was his to unravel. He'd texted her just after sunset, no preamble, just a single line. "Meet me at 9. Wear something you don't mind getting dirty." The words alone had sent a shiver through her, a mix of anticipation and dread, but she didn't hesitate. She'd pulled on a tight black dress that hugged her curves, the hem barely grazing her thighs, and a leather jacket she hadn't worn in years, feeling reckless, like she was stepping into someone else's skin. When she met him outside her apartment, his eyes raked over her, slow and deliberate, that familiar grin tugging at his lips. "Fuck, you look good," he'd said, his voice low, and then he'd grabbed her hand, pulling her into the night without another word. He hadn't told her where they were going, just led her through the crowded streets with that quiet confidence that made her want to follow him anywhere. His hand rested at the small of her back as they crossed the street, his shoulder brushing hers as they wove through the throng of late-night revelers, the contact sending sparks through her every time. She'd lost track of time, of direction, of everything except the heat of him next to her, the way his presence made the city feel smaller, sharper, like it existed just for them. They ended up in a narrow alley behind a dive bar, the kind of place where the music throbbed through the brick walls like a second heartbeat, heavy and primal. The air smelled of rain-soaked asphalt and cigarette smoke, the neon glow from the street barely reaching the shadows where they stood. He stopped suddenly, turning to face her, and pinned her with that look, the one that made her chest tighten, her legs unsteady, her panties damp with a want she couldn't deny. "You trust me?" he asked, his voice low, serious now, stripped of the teasing edge she'd come to expect. His eyes searched hers, dark and intense, like he was asking for more than just this moment. Maya swallowed, her throat dry, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. "Yes," she said, the word soft but certain, a surrender she hadn't planned but couldn't stop. The corner of his mouth curved, not into his usual grin, but something sharper, hungrier, like she'd just handed him a key he'd been waiting to use. "Good," he said, his voice a low growl that sent a shiver straight to her core. And then he kissed her like he meant to fucking ruin her. There was nothing soft about it. His lips crashed into hers, urgent and consuming, his hands sliding into her hair, tugging just hard enough to make her gasp into his mouth. His tongue was hot, demanding, tasting of whiskey and want, and she melted into him, her fingers gripping his jacket, pulling him closer like she could fuse them together. The brick wall at her back was cold, rough, but she didn't care, not when his body was pressed against hers, his hips pinning her in place, the hard length of him evident through his jeans. They were outside, in an alley where anyone could turn the corner, but that only made it hotter, the thrill of being caught lighting her nerves on fire. She laughed against his mouth, breathless and wild, a sound she barely recognized as her own. She'd never done anything like this, never let herself be this reckless, this exposed. But with him, she didn't care. "You're gonna get us caught," she whispered, her voice shaky, her lips brushing his as she spoke. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his eyes dark and dangerous, his breath hot against her ear. "Then be quiet," he murmured, his lips grazing her earlobe, his teeth nipping just hard enough to make her moan. "Or don't. Let them fucking hear you." Her whole body went molten at that, a rush of heat flooding her core, her panties soaked from his words alone. She was done for, completely at his mercy, and she fucking loved it. His hands slid down her sides, rough and possessive, hiking her dress up her thighs until the cool night air hit her skin. She gasped, her nails digging into his shoulders, and he grinned against her neck, his teeth scraping her pulse point as his fingers found the edge of her panties, teasing but not giving her what she wanted, not yet. "You're a fucking tease," she hissed, her hips bucking against his hand, chasing the pressure she needed. "And you're fucking desperate," he growled back, his voice thick with want, his fingers finally slipping under the lace, finding her slick and ready. "Jesus, Maya, you're soaked." His touch was deliberate, slow, drawing a moan from her that she couldn't stifle. her head falling back against the brick as he worked her with a skill that made her vision blur. The city faded, the music, the horns, the distant laughter, until there was nothing but him, his fingers inside her, his mouth on her throat, the rough brick scraping her back through her jacket. Every nerve in her body was alight, her pulse loud enough to drown out the world, her moans mingling with his low curses as he pushed her higher, faster, relentless. "Come for me," he murmured against her skin, his voice a command. And she did, her body shattering around his fingers, her cry muffled against his shoulder as she clung to him, trembling, undone. When it was over, when they were both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers, his hands still gripping her hips, holding her steady as her legs shook. "You're mine now," he said softly, his voice rough but certain, like a vow carved in stone. Maya's breath hitched, her heart still racing, her body still buzzing with the aftershocks. She should have been afraid of what that meant, of how deep she was in, of what came next, but instead she smiled, slow and reckless, matching his intensity for the first time. "Then don't let me go," she said, her voice low, daring him to mean it. He pulled back just far enough to look at her, his eyes dark and dangerous, full of something that made her stomach twist with want and fear and something she couldn't name. "Oh, sweetheart," he said, that grin finally returning, wicked and promising. "I was never fucking planning to." He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers, and led her out of the alley, back into the thrum of the city night. Her legs were still unsteady, her dress slightly askew, her lips swollen from his kisses, but she didn't care. The crowd swallowed them, bodies and lights blurring around them, but Maya couldn't stop smiling, couldn't stop feeling like she'd just stepped off a cliff and had no interest in finding the ground again. This wasn't the end, it was the start of something wilder, something she was ready to burn for.